Who truly built punk rock? History hands the title to one woman, but a second woman walked the same New York streets in the 1970s, sharing the same scene, the same hotel, the same dreams. They called Patti Smith the godmother of punk, yet another voice faded into silence while her legacy was rewritten. The forgotten story of Bebe Buell changes everything we thought we knew about the genre's birth. On a July morning in 1953, in the Navy town of Portsmouth, Virginia, a girl was born into a world of strict military order and conservative expectation, a world that would never quite know what to do with her. Her name was Bebe Buell, and decades later she would reflect that she and Patti Smith came from profoundly different soil. Buell from a disciplined military household, Smith from a religious working-class home, a contrast that shaped how the world received them. In 1971, she escaped the confines of that upbringing and moved to New York City, where her looks opened doors that talent alone might have left shut. She began modeling for Vogue and Elle, becoming the kind of face that editors believed they could sell, a beautiful young woman with the city at her feet. But even then, the pattern of her life was already forming, a pattern of near misses and closed doors that would define her for decades. In 1972, she sat for the legendary photographer Richard Avedon, who shot a series of black and white portraits that should have launched her into the stratosphere of fashion. The editors killed the spread, deciding she was not famous enough for her own feature, a rejection that stung with particular cruelty because it was not about her work at all. She found her way into music through Todd Rundgren, the veteran producer who became her boyfriend and musical mentor, and who would later be revealed as the biological father of her daughter, Liv Tyler. Through Rundgren, she met John Lennon, and in 1973 she stepped into a recording studio with the Plastic Ono Band, laying down tracks that should have been her breakthrough. Those recordings were never officially released, shelved indefinitely, another door swinging shut just as it seemed to open. She had the connections, she had the voice, she had the look, and yet each opportunity seemed to evaporate just as she reached for it. The question that haunts her early years is a simple one. How much talent can a woman possess before the industry decides her beauty is the only thing worth noticing? By 1973, Bebe Buell was 20 years old, living in New York, known to the right people, and still standing exactly where she had started, on the outside looking in. Two young women walked the same hallways of the Chelsea Hotel in the early 1970s, both models, both singers, both circling the same burning core of New York's artistic underground. One of them, Patti Smith, would be crowned the godmother of punk, her 1975 album Horses, enshrined as a foundational text of the genre by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The other, Bebe Buell, would watch that coronation from the periphery, her own name fading into the margins of the same story. The New Yorker once noted their shared social orbit within that legendary building, a free-spirited sanctuary where poets, musicians, and misfits collided. Yet the paths they carved from that common starting point could not have diverged more sharply. Buell herself has reflected on this strange parallel, telling Mojo magazine that their existence as twin feminist symbols highlighted a razor-thin line between triumph and obscurity. She came from a conservative military family, a background of discipline and structure, while Smith emerged from a religious working-class home, a distinction The Guardian highlighted in a 2019 interview as a factor in how each woman was received. Both arrived in the city with ambition and beauty, both picked up guitars and microphones, but the machinery of recognition seemed calibrated to lift one while quietly discarding the other. Was it talent, or was it timing, or was it something far less fair that determined which name would echo through history? The numbers now paint a brutal picture of that divide. By 2022, Bebe Buell's official YouTube channel held roughly 45,000 subscribers, while Patti Smith's channel boasted over 1.2 million, a chasm of public awareness that no amount of artistic merit could bridge. They stood in the same rooms, breathed the same creative air, knew the same players, yet one became an icon and the other a footnote. It is a peculiar cruelty of fate that two women could share so much, only to be separated by an invisible wall of perception and privilege. Their parallel existence is the quiet tragedy at the heart of punk's origin story, a reminder that the industry was never a level playing field, and the women who fought to be heard often found their voices swallowed by the noise. The year 1974 found Bebe Buell entangled with Mick Jagger, the Rolling Stones frontman, who by most accounts actively encouraged her musical ambitions. It was a glamorous chapter, yet it foreshadowed a pattern where her value was perpetually tied to the men she knew, rather than the art she created. Then came the arrival of a daughter, Liv Tyler, in 1975, a child whose paternity was a closely guarded secret, with Todd Rundgren listed as the father while the truth remained hidden. Liv would not learn the identity of her biological father, Steven Tyler, until she was 11, a protective measure that placed a heavy burden on Buell's own career. Was it any wonder that label executives viewed a beautiful single mother as a liability in the raw, aggressive world of punk? The private compromises she made to shield her daughter from fame's harsh glare came at a staggering professional cost. She poured her energy into raising a future star, and the industry in turn seemed to decide she had made her choice. By 1978, a brief and intense romance with Elvis Costello promised a different kind of alliance, a meeting of two sharp musical minds. But when the fling ended, Costello publicly downplayed its seriousness, a dismissal Buell experienced as a profound and very public humiliation. It was the same story repeated with a different soundtrack, her feelings and experiences rendered insignificant by a man's casual denial. The record labels followed suit, echoing a sentiment that was as cruel as it was illogical, one captured in a 2020 interview with her own daughter. Aerosmith's frontman was Steven Tyler, and yet Liv Tyler recounted how her mother was repeatedly told that punk rock music was simply not suitable for a mother. The rejection was so complete that Buell was forced to perform in secret at small venues, hiding her passion to avoid further professional punishment. One can only imagine the quiet rage of pouring your heart into a song, only to be told your very existence as a parent disqualified you from the stage. The most absurd distillation of this prejudice came in 1978, when she was just 25 years old. A senior executive at Atlantic Records sat across from her and delivered the verdict that would seal her fate. She was, he claimed, too old to start a music career. It was a moment she recalled with bitter clarity, a stark illustration that the system was rigged not against her talent, but against her very identity. These were not isolated incidents of professional caution. They were systematic humiliations designed to keep her in her place. The men she loved either used her as a muse or discarded her, while the business world, dominated by men, saw her as a pretty face with an inconvenient voice. While her counterparts were being celebrated for their chaotic brilliance, Buell's beauty was weaponized against her, her credibility questioned because she did not fit the mold of the scraggy male punk icon. She was expected to choose between being a mother and being an artist, and the industry ensured she could not be both. The labels gathered in London that year, with their pronouncements about what punk was supposed to be, and the message they sent to a woman holding a microphone was unmistakable. In 1977, executives at EMI and Virgin Records publicly declared that punk rock was a genre for men, a statement that became one of the many reasons Bebe Buell found herself shut out of long-term contracts. She had already been in the studio for a year by that point, cutting tracks for a debut album that seemed destined for release. Yet that record, recorded in 1976, never saw the light of day, and her only official album arrived in 1981 with little fanfare. The story of that lost album reveals how the machinery worked against her. When Buell was recording her debut, the New York independent label Orc Records quietly slashed her promotional budget and redirected the funds to an up-and-coming male band called the Heartbreakers. The result was a record that never reached a wide audience and was eventually shelved entirely, a career stalled before it could truly begin. The label had already released her single The Boys Are Breaking Up in 1976, but it appeared only as a B-side, buried and unadvertised while male artists received the priority treatment. She watched the resources flow toward the men in the room, knowing her voice was the last thing anyone was listening to. The bias was not merely a matter of unfortunate timing, but a pattern embedded in the industry's foundation. A 2022 study from Harvard University found that male music producers consistently underestimated the songwriting abilities of female musicians, directly reducing the number of women who received recording contracts. This was not an isolated prejudice, but a structural one, woven into the decisions made behind closed doors. Buell herself identified the cruel irony of her situation when she stated in a 2015 interview that she was signed for her looks rather than her voice. The industry had taken her beauty and used it as a reason to dismiss her artistry, treating her appearance as the only currency she had to offer. How could a woman be taken seriously as a punk musician when the men controlling the purse strings saw her as a decorative asset rather than a creative force? The answer for Buell was that she could not. The discrimination she faced was not an exception to the rule, but the rule itself, written into every rejected contract and every shelved tape. On a sticky New York night in 1975, Bebe Buell walked onto the stage of CBGB, the grimy Bowery club that was about to become the birthplace of punk rock. She had the look, the voice, and the connections, yet her performances were routinely ignored by the male critics who flocked to the same venue. In her memoir Rebel Heart, published in 2001, Buell recalled that after one particular show, a prominent Rolling Stone critic wrote a glowing review of the male opening act, while his paragraph on her fixated solely on her wardrobe. Her vocal performance was not acknowledged once, her stage presence dismissed, her entire artistic contribution erased before the ink had dried on the page. The critic who could rhapsodize about a feedback loop had nothing to say about a woman who had fought for her place on that same stage. The notorious critic Lester Bangs in 1976 delivered a cutting remark that has been quoted ever since as a damning example of gendered criticism in music. He said she had the voice of an untrained singer, but her beauty eclipsed everything else, a backhanded assessment that reduced her artistry to a physical attribute. Could there be a more effective way to silence a musician than to tell the world her face mattered more than her sound? The archives of Getty Images from 1975 reveal the visual proof of this imbalance, showing that out of 44 prominent performers at CBGB that year, only 5 were women, less than 12% of the lineup. The stage was a boys' club, the audience a reflection of it, and the critics ensured the narrative stayed firmly in their favour. CBGB is celebrated as a cradle of creative chaos, but for women it was a fortress designed to keep them on the margins. The very place that gave the world the Ramones and the Talking Heads was simultaneously a gatekeeper, deciding whose names would enter history and whose would vanish into a footnote. Each night Buell climbed those stairs and poured her raw energy into songs that deserved attention, yet the applause seemed to evaporate before she even left the building. She was in the room where punk history was being written, but the pens were all held by men who saw her as a curiosity rather than a contributor. How many other women stood in that same spotlight, only to be erased by writers who could not see past a pretty face? This was not an accident, but a relentless pattern, where the microphone was open to women and the doors to recognition were sealed shut. The tragedy is not that she failed, but that the stage itself was never truly hers, a platform that welcomed male rebellion while punishing female ambition with silence. Numbers do not lie, and when you lay them side by side, the story becomes almost unbearable to look at. Consider the memoirs, for instance. Bebe Buell's Rebel Heart, published in 2001, earned genuine critical praise, yet within its first year it sold a modest 30,000 copies, while Patti Smith's Just Kids sailed past 1 million. How can two artists born from the same scene in the same moment produce work of comparable merit yet receive such wildly different receptions? The awards tell a similar tale, for Smith stood before the National Book Awards in 2010 to accept its prestigious honour, while Buell has never received a single major prize for any of her creative output. If words are not enough, let the translation speak, because Just Kids has been rendered into 34 languages, whereas Rebel Heart can be read in just 4, a gap that reveals the machinery of institutional neglect rather than artistic failure. Even in the realm she loved most, music, the evidence stings, since Bebe Buell independently released 4 singles between 2015 and 2023, and not one of them ever appeared on a Billboard chart. But brace yourself for the most damning figure of all, a statistic uncovered by the Los Angeles Times in 2020, which found that among roughly 15,000 articles on punk history published by major outlets, fewer than 2% ever mentioned her name in any context. What exactly did this woman do wrong, other than to arrive with a face too beautiful and a background too polished for a movement that prized raw defiance? Perhaps the academic world holds the key to this injustice, because a 2020 Oxford University study established that all male punk bands were consistently labelled typical through the decades, while their female counterparts were neatly categorised as a political movement. The framework itself was engineered to erase them, and the numbers only confirm that Buell's disappearance was never accidental, never organic, but a systematic outcome of an industry that simply could not see her. In 2014, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame mounted a major exhibition called Women Who Rock, an ambitious tribute to the female artists who shaped the genre. Bebe Buell's name was absent from the official roster, appearing only in an appendix designated for what the curators called quiet pioneers. How can an institution dedicated to preserving musical history so thoroughly erase a woman who was at the centre of its most crucial scene? By 2022, the BBC had produced a 3-hour documentary titled Punk the History, a sweeping account of the movement that was supposed to set the record straight. Bebe Buell had been interviewed for 2 full hours by the producers, sharing her stories, her struggles, and her perspective on an era she helped define. When the film finally aired, her total screen time amounted to exactly 14 seconds, a measure she publicly described on her Instagram page as her final insult. The behind-the-scenes reality of that broadcast cuts even deeper. Bebe Buell revealed that after the extensive interview, every single segment featuring her voice was edited out of the final cut, leaving her name appearing nowhere except in the credits thank you section. Here was a woman who had lived through the birth of punk, who had shared stages and studios with its most legendary figures, being rendered invisible by the very people who claimed to be documenting its history. Academic research confirms this pattern of erasure is no accident. A 2021 study from Cambridge University Press, examining music history scholarship, found that women appear in only about 7% of pages dedicated to the history of punk rock. The systematic absence of female voices from the historical record is not a matter of oversight, but a structural feature of how the genre's story has been told by those who controlled the narrative. The mainstream press has finally begun to acknowledge the damage. In 2023, The New Yorker published a piece that called Bebe Buell, one of punk rock's most tragic figures, highlighting the waste of talent caused by gender prejudice. But even this acknowledgement carries a bitter irony. It takes nearly 5 decades for a woman's contributions to be recognised with such a label, and by then, the careers that should have flourished are long gone. Consider the full scope of her erasure: no major retrospective, no Hall of Fame induction, no dedicated chapter in any authoritative text on the subject. The omission is so complete that a casual student of music history would never know she existed, and that is precisely the point. Her disappearance from the official record was not the result of a single biased gatekeeper, but a web of decisions made across decades by curators, editors, and historians who collectively decided her story did not fit the narrative they wanted to tell. The silence surrounding Bebe Buell is not an anomaly within punk historiography. It is the established pattern, and recognizing that fact forces us to question what else has been left out of the story we think we know. She was not an exception. She was the rule. Look at the numbers and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. According to the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative in 2020, women accounted for barely a third of the artists played on mainstream rock radio, their presence dwarfed by all male bands who dominated the airwaves without question. The same story echoed in the corporate suites where contracts were signed. A Forbes analysis from 2021 found that female artists held roughly 22% of the deals with the major American labels, and even then, they were paid on average 40% less than their male counterparts. The disparity was not a streak of bad luck, it was architecture. The machinery of the music business was built with a bias so deep that it functioned like a law of physics. Streaming platforms, often hailed as the great democratizers, only told a newer version of the same old tale. Spotify's own Loud and Clear report documented a rise in female artists streamed between 2018 and 2023, climbing to 35%, and yet the figure still trailed men by a staggering margin, proving that growth was not the same as equality. The creative pipeline itself was poisoned. The BBC's 2018 survey pulled back the curtain on a working environment where 68% of women reported experiencing sexual harassment or discrimination, a number that stood in stark contrast to the sanitized reports issued by the labels themselves. Imagine walking into a studio knowing those odds were stacked against you, that your voice would be judged not on its merit, but on the category of your gender. And the judgment began long before the microphone was switched on. A 2022 study from Harvard University, published in the Harvard Business Review, revealed that male producers consistently undervalued the songwriting abilities of female musicians, a subconscious prejudice that directly translated into fewer women being signed. Each rejection Bebe Buell faced, every closed door she walked away from, was not an isolated act of cruelty, but a single turn of a vast and grinding machine. Her story is the story of a system that decided, long before she ever sang a note, who deserved to be heard. For decades, the music industry had told her she was too old, too pretty, or simply the wrong kind of woman to matter. So Bebe Buell decided to build the stage herself, and in 2021 she produced a benefit concert that raised roughly $250,000 for young female artists, with Debbie Harry and Chrissie Hynde standing beside her as proof that solidarity could outlast the gatekeepers. It was a small act of defiance against the very machinery that had erased her, yet she refused to let the next generation face the same closed doors. Then came the invitation that should have arrived 40 years earlier, when Glastonbury finally asked her to perform in 2023, marking her debut on that legendary main stage at the age of 70. The crowd that greeted her was not the one she might have commanded in the 70s, but their cheers carried a different kind of weight, the sound of a debt finally being acknowledged. That same year, in a modest Nashville ceremony, she accepted the Women in Music Legacy Award, her first major honor in a career spanning nearly 5 decades, and the irony was not lost on her. A lifetime of being told she was too late had ended with the industry pretending it had always known her worth. Even at New York University in 2022, she stood before a room of aspiring musicians and offered the advice she never received, telling the young women to never let anyone define their value by their gender. She spoke not with bitterness but with the calm of someone who had watched the patterns repeat and finally decided to name them out loud. Is this what redemption looks like? A single plaque and a festival slot after 50 years of silence? The applause at that university gathering was not just for her words but for the survival they represented, a woman who had refused to become a footnote. Yet for every honour she collected, there remained the quiet ache of what never came, the album shelved, the tours unbooked, the reviews that mentioned only her face. She had given everything to a scene that had given her almost nothing back, and still she showed up to build doors for others. The recognition was real, and it was warm, but it arrived with the unmistakable shape of a promise broken too many times to count. Here was a woman who had spent her life fighting to be heard, only to be handed a microphone when the room had mostly emptied. But Bebe Buell did not rage against the timing. She simply took the stage, sang her songs, and let the late applause wash over her like rain after a drought. She was the daughter of a conservative military household, raised on bases where order and discipline were the only languages spoken, while Patti Smith grew up in a religious working-class home in New Jersey, where doubt and rebellion were part of the daily bread. Bebe Buell has spoken openly about that contrast, noting how their different upbringings shaped not just their art but the way the world allowed itself to receive them. The public could romanticize Smith's struggle as authentic punk pedigree, while Buell's polished naval family background read as privilege, as something that needed to be overcome rather than celebrated. But here is the uncomfortable question that lingers. Was Buell's beauty the real obstacle? The thing that made critics instinctively reach for their pens to describe her face instead of her voice? When Lester Bangs remarked in 1976 that she had an untrained voice but that her beauty overshadowed everything else, he was not being cruel. He was being honest about a system that saw her body before it ever heard her music. That single sentence, quoted across decades, became a prison cell disguised as a compliment, a label that no amount of songwriting could ever peel away. In the punk world, where authenticity was measured in ragged edges and visible struggle, a strikingly beautiful woman was automatically suspect. Her photographs read as a gimmick, her stage presence dismissed as performance rather than passion. Perceived as too polished, too glamorous, and therefore insufficiently hungry, Buell occupied a strange purgatory where her very appearance disqualified her from the credibility she had earned through sheer persistence. Women in punk were already fighting against a tide that classified their work as political statements rather than artistic expressions, a pattern documented by Oxford researchers in 2020 who found that all male bands were routinely labelled typical while female bands were filed under social movements. Folding Buell into that framework made her doubly invisible, because she was not only a woman but a beautiful woman, and beauty in that subculture was treated as a contradiction of the genre's supposed honesty. The critics seemed to decide that a face like hers could not possibly contain a voice worth hearing, that her aesthetics must somehow invalidate her musicianship. So they wrote about her clothes, her hair, her relationships, and never once about the songs she had poured herself into. It was a quiet, systematic erasure, and the tragedy is that it worked. Because today her name conjures images of magazine covers and famous lovers rather than the records she fought to make. Class and appearance, those two silent arbiters, had already decided her fate before she ever stepped onto a stage, and no amount of talent could ever override the sentence passed by a glance. There is a particular kind of quiet victory in outlasting every closed door. Bebe Buell did not simply survive the machinery that tried to erase her. She built a legacy that the machinery could not touch. Perhaps her most profound mark on the world came through her daughter, Liv Tyler, whose rise as a supermodel and beloved actress in the 1990s was deliberately shaped by her mother's hand, as noted in Vogue. She turned her own experience into a blueprint for a different kind of success, one where the art of raising a person became as significant as any album ever pressed. After decades of being told her voice did not fit, she channeled that frustration into a purpose larger than her own career, becoming an advocate for the next generation of women. But the recognition she deserved was not something the old guard could grant her, so she created her own stage. In 2021, she produced a charity night to fund young female artists, raising $250,000 through the support of icons like Debbie Harry and Chrissie Hynde, as reported by Rolling Stone UK. Here was a woman who had been denied a platform by every major label in the country, building one herself out of sheer will and the loyalty of her peers. She did not wait for permission to lead. She simply started leading, and the industry that once dismissed her found itself following her example. It was a quiet, elegant rebuke to every executive who had ever said no. Finally, after nearly 5 decades of relentless work, the official world began to notice, however tentatively. In June of 2023, at a modest ceremony in Nashville, Tennessee, she received the Women in Music Legacy Award, the very first honor of her entire career, as detailed by the Nashville scene. It was a moment that should have happened 30 years earlier, when the songs were fresh and the fire was at its hottest. Yet the significance was not lost on her. It proved that the story was not dead, only waiting for the right time to be told. She accepted the prize not as a culmination, but as a confirmation that persistence has its own final word. And still the numbers tell a brutal truth that cannot be polished away. In 2022, her official YouTube channel held roughly 45,000 subscribers, while Patti Smith's boasted over 1.2 million, a chasm in public recognition that data analysis makes painfully clear. It is easy to think of that gap as a measure of worth, but perhaps it is better understood as a measure of a system's bias. The world heard one narrative clearly and allowed another to flicker in the dark, not because the music was lacking, but because the listener was not ready. So what is a legacy when the history books refuse to write your name? Bebe Buell's is not found in the archives of major labels or on the playlists of corporate radio. It lives in the daughter she raised and protected, in the careers she quietly championed, and in the thousands of women who came after her and found the path slightly easier. The official industry may have forgotten her, but she never forgot herself, and that self-belief is a monument no neglect can tear down. She gave her life to a sound, and even when the world refused to listen, she kept making the sound for the pure love of making it. Has she been erased? Perhaps from the headlines, but not from the fabric of punk itself, which she helped weave with every single note she sang and every single door she refused to accept. The work stands on its own, unencumbered by the need for gold records or Hall of Fame plaques. She taught her daughter to be an it girl, not by magazine covers, but by showing her how to move through a hostile world with grace and defiance. That is a masterpiece of a different kind, one you cannot stream or download, only witness in the lives she has touched. There is a thin line, she once said, between success and oblivion in the music world, a line she knew perhaps better than anyone. Her own path ran parallel to that of Patti Smith, two women who stood as twin feminist icons in the same city, yet their trajectories could not have diverged more sharply. While Smith was celebrated with a National Book Award in 2010 for her memoir Just Kids, Buell has never received a single major prize for any of her work, a silence that speaks volumes about who gets remembered and who gets erased. It is a story that mirrors the experience of countless other women whose contributions were systematically overlooked, their voices swallowed by an industry that preferred its heroes male. So when we ask who truly built punk rock, the answer is no longer a simple one. We have seen how a woman from a conservative military family, with a voice and a vision, was pushed aside while her male counterparts were elevated to legend. Bebe Buell's life is not just a singular tragedy, but a symbol of the thousands of women whose names never made it into the history books. The loss is not just hers, it is ours, a gap in our collective memory where a vital piece of the story should be. What does it mean to be forgotten? To have your art dismissed, not for its quality, but for your gender and your beauty. Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that talent alone has never been enough, that the world often decides who gets to be a star based on factors far removed from artistic merit. We are left to wonder how much richer our cultural history would be if these women had been given the same chance to be heard. So I ask you now, which other forgotten women in music deserve to have their stories told? Share their names in the comments, because the first step in correcting this injustice is remembering. And as we close this chapter, the question that opened it rings truer than ever, now answered not by a legend, but by the woman history left behind.